That night, a snowstorm swallowed Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and the wind cut so hard it made the cabin groan. Ethan Cole thought it would be just another lonely winter night, until a soft scraping started at his back door. When he cracked it open, he froze. Two bobcats, crusted with ice, stood pressed together like they were begging to come inside. The frightening part wasn't that they were wild. It was why they chose Ethan's door and what might be trailing them through the whiteout. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. The wind off Lake Superior didn't howl so much as it scraped, a long, steady rasp that made the windows tremble in their frames. Ethan Cole lay awake in the dark, listening to the cabin settle and creak the way old wood does when the temperature drops hard. The air inside smelled faintly of pine, diesel, and the clean bite of coal that always found its way through the cracks, no matter how tight he sealed them. Outside, the world had turned the color of ash. Snow packed over snow, moonlight dulled by cloud, the tree line reduced to black strokes against a white sheet. He should have been sleeping. Tomorrow promised another round of calls. Someone's heat acting up, someone's standby generator coughing in the cold, another emergency repair that couldn't wait because winter didn't negotiate. Folks around here didn't talk about comfort. They talked about survival. Ethan knew the drill. Keep the furnace running, keep the pipes from freezing, keep the lights on. And if you were smart, you kept your homeowner's insurance paperwork where you could find it fast, because one cracked line or one ice-damaged roof could turn into a claim before breakfast. A sound cut through the wind, soft, wrong, and close. Not the slap of branches, not the skitter of a squirrel. A careful scraping at the back door. Then again, then a thin, strained noise, like breath trying to become a cry and failing halfway. Ethan sat up so quickly the blanket slid to his waist. The cabin felt suddenly louder, clock ticking, stove metal ticking as it cooled, his own pulse thudding in his ears. He swung his feet onto the floorboards. The wood was icy under his soles. He moved by habit, slow and quiet, because the woods didn't care what time it was, and neither did whatever was outside. At the kitchen window, he lifted the edge of the curtain. Snow whipped sideways in the porch light, bright as blown flour. For a moment, he saw nothing but white motion. Then two shapes shifted at the foot of the steps, low to the ground, hunched, almost buried. The light caught their coats in patches. Mottled tawny fur glazed with frost, whiskers crusted white, ears dark and sharp against the storm. Bobcats. His stomach tightened. They weren't supposed to be here, not this close, not like this. One was larger, standing in front as if bracing against the wind. The smaller one pressed against its flank, shaking so hard Ethan could see the tremor ripple through its ribs. Their eyes reflected. The porch light, golden, glassy, too still. And yet there was no charge, no snarl, no sudden flash of teeth. Just a desperate patience that felt almost human in its need. Ethan's hand hovered over the deadbolt. He could picture the sensible choice. Keep the door shut, call it in, let professionals handle it. There were wildlife response numbers for that. There were wildlife removal services advertised on the bulletin board at Hank Dorsey's gas station. There were rules, there were reasons. But then the smaller bobcat tried to step forward and faltered. Its back leg dragged for half a beat before it caught itself, and Ethan felt something cold and heavy settle behind his ribs. A creature didn't come to a man's door in a blizzard unless it had run out of every other option. Another scrape at the door, gentler now, almost a tap. The larger bobcat lifted its head and looked straight at the window, not with threat, but with a steady, aching focus, as if it knew exactly where Ethan stood. His breath fogged the glass. "Lord, what are you doing out there?" he whispered, voice swallowed by the cabin. He turned the knob just enough to crack the door. A blade of wind knifed in, stinging his cheeks, bringing the sharp scent of snow and something else, wet fur, earth, and the faint metallic tang that made his skin prickle. The larger bobcat didn't bolt. It leaned in, cautious and trembling, and the smaller one followed like it was being held upright by will alone. Ethan stepped back, heart hammering, and widened the opening. The choice was made, and he had no idea what it would cost or what it would change. The instant the door opened wider, the cold rushed in like a living thing. It carried the sharp, clean sting of snow and the damp animal warmth underneath it, wet fur, breath, and something wild that didn't belong in a kitchen. Ethan's eyes watered. He fought the instinct to slam the door back shut. The larger bobcat stepped over the threshold first. Its paws made almost no sound on the floorboards, just a faint, soft tap that felt too quiet for something that could tear through a rabbit in seconds. The smaller one followed, but not smoothly. It moved like a machine with a bad hinge, one back leg lagging a fraction, then catching up, trembling as it tried to keep its balance. Ethan heard a thin, shaky exhale from it, a sound halfway between a cough and a whine. He backed up with both hands raised, palms out, the way you'd calm a spooked horse. The cabin light was low and honey-colored, a single lamp by the table throwing warm circles on the walls. The bobcats looked wrong in that warmth, winter creatures dragged into a place of coffee mugs and toolboxes, their coats dotted with ice crystals that glittered like salt. Ethan grabbed the old wool blanket from the chair and dragged it closer to the stove, keeping his body turned sideways so he didn't look like a threat. He set a shallow metal pan down and poured in a sajiu, little lukewarm water, watching the surface tremble. The stove ticked as it warmed, and the sound suddenly seemed loud in the tense silence. The larger bobcat didn't bolt deeper into the cabin the way Ethan expected. It stopped a few feet in, then sat, slow and deliberate, placing itself squarely between Ethan and the injured one. Not aggressive, not panicked. Protective. Like a guard dog that didn't trust you yet, but was too tired to keep running. That was the first shock. The second came when the big bobcat made a low, rough sound, more breath than growl, and tipped its head toward the smaller one, then toward Ethan, as if insisting he pay attention. The smaller bobcat's ears flattened. It lowered itself onto the blanket with a heavy, helpless sag, and Ethan saw the way its flank fluttered with each breath. He swallowed hard. His mouth tasted like stale winter air and old coffee. "All right," he murmured, voice thin. "All right. I see you." He didn't rush in. He pulled on the thick leather gloves he kept by the door for hauling fuel cans, then crouched at a careful distance. The floorboards were cold through his jeans. The bobcat's eyes tracked every motion he made, pupils wide in the lamplight. Ethan could hear his own breathing, louder than it should have been, and the faint whisper of wind pushing against the cabin walls. The smaller bobcat shifted again and hissed, brief, pained, not angry. Ethan's chest tightened. He angled the lamp and saw what the storm had tried to hide. The back paw looked swollen, the fur around it clumped and darkened, and the leg quivered as if it couldn't decide whether to hold weight or give up. There was a faint line in the fur higher up, a compressed track that didn't look like a normal scrape from ice or brush. Ethan's mind jumped to a dozen practical problems the way it always did. What if it panicked? What if it tore up the room? What if this ended with stitches and an emergency room bill? He thought of the number on his fridge for emergency generator repair and the paperwork folder marked home warranty and insurance. The way adult life always seemed to come down to who paid for the damage. But then the larger bobcat leaned forward just slightly and pressed its shoulder closer to the smaller one, sheltering it from Ethan without leaving. A slow blink. A steady stare, not pleading like a person would plead, something older and quieter than that, Something that simply said, "We are here because we have nowhere else." Ethan felt the weight of the moment settle over him, heavier than the snow outside. He reached for his flashlight, careful and slow, and as he did, a faint greasy scent rose from the injured bobcat's coat, subtle, almost hidden under the smell of wet fur. It snagged at his memory in a way he couldn't name yet. Outside, the wind scraped and scraped at the world. Inside, two wild cats waited, and Ethan realized he was already past the point of turning back. Ethan kept his distance, but the longer the bobcat stayed, the more the cabin filled with small, unmistakable details. Meltwater dripped from their coats in slow ticks onto the floor, darkening the pine boards into little maps. The air carried that greasy note again, faint, like a rag left too long in a garage, mixed with wet fur and the clean smoke of his wood stove. He aimed the flashlight low, letting the beam skim instead of stabbing. The larger bobcat watched with the stillness of something trained by winter. The smaller one lay on the blanket, chest fluttering, whiskers trembling each time it tried to pull warm air into lungs that had swallowed too much cold. When Ethan shifted the light toward the injured leg, he saw more than swelling. Tiny black specks clung to the fur, soot maybe, or ground-up rubber. And along the back haunch, half hidden under frozen guard hairs, was a tight groove as if something had cinched and slipped. Not a clean cut, not a natural scrape from ice. It looked like trouble. That smell snapped a memory into place. Earlier that afternoon, he'd been out by the old service road that dead-ended near abandoned storage buildings everybody pretended not to see. A client had called about a backup generator that wouldn't start. Winter, power flickers, panic. Ethan had gone because that's what you do up here. Keep the heat on so folks don't end up calling an emergency plumber for burst pipes or filing a homeowner's insurance claim over ice damage. The building had been quiet, too quiet, with snow piled against the loading dock and a padlock that looked newer than everything around it. Inside, the generator smelled of stale fuel and dirty oil. He'd noticed a smear of grease on the concrete and boot prints that didn't match the owner's story. At the time, he'd told himself it wasn't his business. Fix the machine. Go home. Now, with two frozen bobcats in his kitchen, it felt like it had been his business all along. Outside, the wind paused for a breath, and in that hush, Ethan heard something else. A crunch, slow and deliberate, boots compressing snow. A pale sweep of light passed across the far window, searching. The larger bobcat rose without sound. Its ears pricked forward, body rigid, and a low rumble started deep in its chest. Not loud, but serious. Ethan's throat went dry. He set the flashlight down and eased toward the window. Another flash of light crossed the glass, brighter this time. A man's silhouette stood just beyond the porch rail, shoulders hunched against the weather. A voice carried through the wind, close enough to raise goose flesh. "Hey," the man called, polite on the surface, sharp underneath. "You seen any cats out here?" "Bobcats. They were headed this way." Ethan stared at the deadbolt, then at the animals behind him, and felt the cabin shrink around a single, dangerous choice. Ethan didn't open the door. He slid the chain into place, then cracked it, just enough for the porch light to spill in a thin yellow stripe. Cold air slipped through the gap and stung his nose. Outside, the man's flashlight beam wobbled across the snow, then steadied as if he'd found what he wanted. Ethan's face, framed in warm cabin light. The stranger stood a few yards back, half swallowed by blowing white. He wore a dark cap pulled low and a coat dusted with ice. Ethan couldn't make out his eyes, only the pale plume of breath and the slow lift of his shoulders as he spoke, too calm for this hour. "Just checking," the man said. "I tracked a couple bobcats. They've been causing trouble. You see 'em come through here?" Behind Ethan, the larger bobcat rose like a shadow. It placed itself between Ethan and the blanket, ears forward, body tight. The injured one pressed lower, a tremor running through it. Ethan felt the hair on his arms rise under his flannel. "No," Ethan said, keeping his voice even. "Haven't seen anything tonight." The man tilted his head, listening past the wind. For a second, everything held still, the stove ticking, the clock clicking, Ethan's heart thumping too loud. Ethan caught a whiff of something sharp and stale, like cigarettes soaked into wool. "Huh," the man replied. "Mind if I take a quick look around your porch? Sometimes they crawl under steps." Ethan's grip tightened on the door edge. He pictured wet tracks on his floor, the blanket by the stove, the pan of water. He pictured how fast a bad choice could turn into a 911 call, or an expensive emergency locksmith visit if someone forced a lock in this weather. "Not tonight," Ethan said. "Storm's bad. I'm not having anybody walking around my place." The stranger didn't argue. He simply nodded once, slow, and swept his light toward the tree line. "All right," he said, voice almost friendly. "If you do see 'em, call Wildlife Removal Services. Safer that way." Then he stepped back, disappearing into the snow, but not far. Ethan watched the faint glow of the flashlight hover beyond the pines, lingering like a watching eye. The larger bobcat kept its stare on the window, the low rumble fading into silence. Ethan eased the door shut, slid the deadbolt, and set his phone on the table. One bar of service blinked in and out. He hated the thought, but it pressed in anyway. He'd spent years keeping other people's homes safe, yet he'd never bothered with a simple security camera or home security system for his own cabin. He looked at the bobcats, 2 wild lives trembling in his heat, and made his decision. He found the number for Great Lakes Wildlife Response, and his thumb hovered over call, listening to the wind scrape the walls like a warning. The call went through on the 3rd try, the signal crackling like dry leaves. Ethan held the phone close to his ear, listening to the tiny pops of static and the distant, steady voice on the other end. "Great Lakes Wildlife Response," the woman answered. Her tone was calm, practiced, like someone who'd talked strangers down from bad decisions in the middle of the night more times than she could count. "This is Dr. Morgan Reyes." Ethan kept his eyes on the bobcats while he spoke. The larger one sat upright, chin lifted, still facing the window, as if it could see through wood and glass. The injured one lay on the blanket near the stove, but its breathing was uneven, quick little pulls that sounded like paper being crumpled in a fist. "I'm not looking to keep them," Ethan said quietly. "I just, opened my door, and they walked in. They're frozen. One's hurt." There was a pause that didn't feel like judgment, more like Morgan was choosing the safest words. "You did a kind thing," she said at last, "but I need you to hear me. Bobcats are still wild. Even exhausted, they can lash out if they feel cornered. Do not try to pick them up. Do not feed them by hand. Keep your space. Keep your exit." Ethan swallowed. The cabin smelled of warm wood and wet fur, and the light from the lamp made everything look softer than it really was. His fingers were still numb from the earlier blast of cold at the door. "I had a man outside," Ethan added, and felt his stomach tighten as he said it out loud. "Flashlight, asking if I'd seen them." Morgan's voice sharpened, not louder, just more precise. "What did he say, exactly?" Ethan repeated it, word for word. When he finished, there was another short silence, and he could almost hear Morgan's mind moving, assembling pieces. "Ethan," she said, "that's not normal. Bobcats don't usually come to a cabin unless something is very wrong, and people don't track them in a blizzard unless they have a reason." She exhaled slowly. "I'm bringing in a warden." Within minutes, another voice joined the call, steady, no nonsense, adult to the bone. "Riley Bennett," the man said, "Michigan DNR." Riley asked questions the way a furnace technician checks a failing system. Methodical, unemotional, thorough. Where was Ethan's cabin? Which direction did the man come from? Did Ethan see a vehicle? Any plates? Any distinguishing marks? Ethan answered, listening to the clock tick and the stove click and the wind scrape the roof. Then his landline rang. An old sound, sharp and urgent in the quiet. Ethan flinched. Only one person still called that number. "Hank Dorsey here," came the gravelly voice from the gas station down by the highway. Ethan had called Hank earlier for advice, and Hank had called back like he always did, late, direct, and worried. "You hearing about the wires?" Hank asked. "Fella came in 2 days ago buying steel cable and asking about the old storage road. Didn't smell like a hunter, smelled like money." Hank lowered his voice. "Ethan, if you got animals in your place, lock up. I mean it. Folks like that don't care about your locks or your homeowner's insurance. They care about what they came for." Ethan felt the cabin tighten around him again. He glanced at the deadbolt, the chain, the thin window glass. A home security system suddenly sounded less like a luxury and more like a lifeline. Riley spoke into Ethan's ear like he was standing right there. "I'm coming," he said. "Morgan, too. Keep your lights low. Don't open that door for anyone. If you feel threatened, call 911. I'd rather you overreact than end up needing an emergency room or a personal injury lawyer because someone decided your porch was convenient." Ethan looked down at the 2 bobcats, one guarding, one barely holding on. Outside, the storm kept erasing tracks, but it couldn't erase the feeling that something had already found his cabin. And now it knew where to wait. By late morning, the storm had grown teeth. The sky was a dull, pewter lid, and snow drove sideways in stinging sheets. Ethan watched from a slit in the curtain until a truck finally nosed through the white. Riley Bennett climbed out first, boots crunching like breaking glass. Dr. Morgan Reyes followed, and a third man, Caleb Shaw, hauled gear from the bed, a hard carrier, thick blankets, a sled, a small med kit. Their breath rose in pale clouds and vanished. Inside, the cabin felt warm enough to fool a person. The bobcats weren't fooled. The larger one stood, body taut, ears tracking every new sound. The injured one stayed low on the blanket, breathing in quick, thin pulls. "We guide them," Morgan said softly. "No grabbing, no hero moves." Caleb laid the carrier on its side and draped the opening so it looked like a dark den. Riley kept his hands visible and his eyes moving, the way a man does when he's worried about more than animals. Ethan caught himself thinking of locks, of home insurance paperwork, of how a security camera would have shown the stranger's face. They moved inch by inch. Ethan slid the blanket forward. Morgan's voice stayed calm, steady as a hymn. The injured bobcat shivered, then dragged itself toward the darkness. The larger one followed, not fleeing, escorting. When both were inside, Caleb eased the door shut with a soft click that sounded too loud. Outside, the wind slapped the cabin hard enough to make the stovepipe rattle. "The road's blocked," Riley said. "We've got to go out by snowmobile." Ethan stared at the white blur beyond the door. Morgan met his eyes. "If we wait, the injured one loses more. Frostbite doesn't pause." Her gaze flicked to the window. "And you're not safe here." They strapped the carrier to the sled and stepped into the blast of cold. The air bit so sharp it tasted like pennies. Caleb's snowmobile coughed, then roared, an angry mechanical growl that shook Ethan's ribs. They hadn't gone far when something thumped inside the carrier. Not panic. Urgent. Through the vent slats, Ethan saw the larger bobcat's golden eyes fixed on the woods to their left, as if pulling them that way. "Hold up!" Riley shouted over the engine. He crouched and brushed snow aside with a gloved hand. Under the fresh powder were tracks, 2 sets they expected, and a third line that dragged and wavered like someone had pulled a heavy branch through the snow. Riley's face tightened. "There's another one." Ethan's stomach dropped. 2 bobcats hadn't come to his door for warmth alone. They'd come because they couldn't carry their third, and the storm was still rising, swallowing sound and color until even Riley's red tail light looked like a fading ember in milk-white air. Ethan tasted cold metal on his tongue and knew whatever came next could cost more than a generator repair bill or an urgent care visit. It could cost lives. Riley killed the engine, and the sudden silence felt louder than the snowmobile ever had. In the whiteout, the world shrank to a few yards of visibility, gray air, hard wind, and the hush of snow landing on snow. Ethan's eyelashes prickled with ice. Every breath burned, sharp and dry, like inhaling winter itself. They followed the dragging track off the service path, moving slow so they wouldn't lose it. Caleb took the lead with a short-handled shovel and a headlamp. Riley stayed a step behind, scanning the tree line as if the storm might spit someone out at any moment. Ethan trailed with his work bag slung across his shoulder. Pliers, cutters, the small tools he used for generator repairs, suddenly feeling like the difference between life and death. The track weakened under the pines. It became a smear, then a staggered set of prints, then nothing at all, until Caleb froze and lifted a hand. A sound came from beneath a low cedar. A wet, rattling breath, faint as paper tearing. Ethan crouched, his knees protesting in the cold, and shone his light low. The beam caught fur the color of dried grass, dusted with frost. A third bobcat lay curled tight against the trunk, eyes half open, body trembling in short, exhausted waves. Its chest rose and fell too fast. The air around it smelled sour and metallic, the way fear smells on an animal, and underneath that, something sharp, like old oil. Then Ethan saw the reason it hadn't run. A thin loop of cable bit into the bobcat's leg, pulled tight enough to sink into fur. It wasn't gory, but it was cruel, skin-pinched, circulation fading, the limb cold and numb in a way Ethan understood too well from busted pipes and frozen lines. He swallowed hard, fighting the urge to rush in. "Easy," Morgan's voice crackled through Riley's radio, thin with static. "Don't tug, don't make it fight." The bobcat tried to lift its head. It made a small sound, not a growl, more like a broken cough. Its eyes flicked to Ethan's hands and then away, as if it didn't have the strength to be afraid properly. Riley's gaze snapped to the snow beside the cedar. "Boot prints," he said quietly. Ethan looked and felt his stomach drop. The marks were fresh, not softened by drifting snow. Someone had been here. Recently. A shadow shifted somewhere beyond the trees, just a darker patch in the gray, but it was enough to make the back of Ethan's neck tighten. Riley straightened, one hand raised in a warning, his voice low and firm. "Whoever's out there," he called, "leave, now." Nothing answered except the wind, but Ethan could feel the weight of being watched, the same way you can feel eyes on you in a quiet church. Caleb held the bobcat's shoulders gently with a blanket, keeping it from thrashing. Ethan slid closer, the snow squeaking under his knees. His gloved fingers were clumsy in the cold, but he found the cable with the tip of his cutters and steadied his breathing. He thought, absurdly, of paperwork, how an accident out here would mean a long drive, an emergency room bill, maybe even calling a personal injury attorney if something went wrong. Then he shoved that thought away. This wasn't about money. This was about time. "One clean cut," Caleb murmured. Ethan squeezed. The cutters bit. The cable snapped with a crisp, metallic pop, that echoed through the trees. The bobcat flinched, then sagged as if the pain had been holding it upright. Caleb wrapped it fully, burrito tight, leaving only its face exposed. Its breath puffed weakly into the fabric, warm for a second before freezing into tiny crystals on the edge of the blanket. Riley kept scanning the woods. "We move. Right now." They carried the bobcat back through the storm, Ethan's arms burning, his lungs aching with each cold breath. When they reached the sled, the carrier shifted again. Through the vents, the larger bobcat made a low, urgent sound, and the injured one answered with a thin whine. As Caleb set the third bobcat down, still wrapped, the carrier went suddenly quiet, as if the two inside recognized the rhythm of that breathing, the scent of that fur, the presence they'd been searching for. For one brief moment, even the storm seemed to pause. The snowmobile finally punched through the worst of the whiteout, its headlight a weak cone in the gray, and then, like a curtain lifting, the highway lights appeared ahead, soft and amber. Ethan's face stung from the wind, cheeks raw and numb, but his hands stayed steady on the sled straps as Caleb secured the carriers. The storm still hissed across the open ground, yet the sound had shifted. It was less like a scream now, more like a long, tired exhale. Inside the carrier, the larger bobcat made a low, pulsing call, quiet but insistent. Caleb eased the blanket-wrapped third bobcat closer, just for a moment, so Morgan could check its leg and breathing before they loaded up. The instant the third bobcat's scent reached the vent slats, the carrier came alive with small, urgent sounds. A thin whine from the injured one, then a soft, broken chirp from the larger cat. Like a note, it had been holding back all night. Morgan opened the carrier door a careful inch. What happened next didn't look like fear. It looked like relief. The injured bobcat dragged itself forward, trembling, and pressed its face into the blanket as if memorizing warmth. The larger one leaned in too, touching noses, brief, gentle, almost reverent. Ethan felt his throat tighten, the way it does when a hymn hits you in the chest without warning. Even Riley, who'd been nothing but granite up to that point, looked away for a second and swallowed hard. "They found you," Morgan murmured, voice softened by awe. "They brought you to a door." They drove straight to Great Lakes Wildlife Response. The clinic lights were bright and clean, the air smelling of disinfectant and coffee. So ordinary, it felt strange after the raw, metallic scent of storm. Morgan and her team moved with practiced speed. Warming pads, fluids, careful exams. Frostbite, dehydration, a tightened snare injury that had started to steal circulation. But the third bobcat was still fighting. So were the other two. Before Ethan left, Morgan handed him a printed number and a promise. "We'll update you. And Riley's opening an investigation. Those boot prints weren't yours, and that cable didn't come from the forest." Riley met Ethan in the parking lot, snow crunching under their boots like sugar. "We'll handle it," he said. "But you did the right thing. Most folks would have called Wildlife Removal Services and stayed out of it. You gave them a chance." Ethan drove back to his cabin through a world washed pale blue by dawn. The kitchen looked the same, table, chair, stove, but it felt different, like a room that had heard a confession and would never forget it. He replaced the bent door chain, then, without overthinking it, he ordered a simple security camera and home security system. Nothing fancy, just enough to know who was on his porch before he ever cracked the door again. He'd seen how fast a quiet night could turn into a situation that belonged on an incident report, not a homeowner's insurance claim. 2 weeks later, Morgan sent a short message. The injured bobcat was walking better. The third was gaining strength. All three were eating well. Another message followed from Riley. They'd linked the cable to supplies sold locally, and the helpful stranger had stopped showing up at the gas station. And then, one evening, Ethan checked the camera trap he'd set near the tree line, more habit than hope. The screen flickered, and there it was. A bobcat, coat sleek again, standing in the snow like a carved statue. It looked toward the cabin, held still for one long heartbeat, and then melted back into the dark. Ethan stood by the window, palm resting against the cold glass, and felt something settle inside him. Quiet, steady, and surprisingly warm. If it were you, would you have opened that door? Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.